For our last topic, we look at the question of sovereignty. What does it mean to be sovereign? Now, I mentioned this before, that essentially sovereignty means the right to act unilaterally within territorial boundaries. A sovereign nation is a nation that can act within its territorial boundaries. Related to that is the notion that sovereignty means that under international law, a state cannot unilaterally act within the territorial boundaries of another state. So this, of course, seems logical on its face, but obviously there have been many recent instances, in which the West, the United States, and many of its allies have unilaterally acted within the territorial boundaries of another state and thereby infringed on sovereignty. Most dramatically, the war in Iraq, beginning in 2003, when the United States invaded Iraq with the intention of changing the government against the will of the Iraqi people. The United States invaded and substituted a government that was more to its liking. So clearly in that case, it turned out that Iraq was not a sovereign government because the United States was able to invade and take over. So sovereignty is a questionable issue in light of when can you lose it, how do you attain it. So when we study sovereignty, one of the things we want to talk about is how does it work? How does one become sovereign over a territory, and to what extent can a state act without violating the sovereign rights of its neighbors? Alright, to understand sovereignty, we look first at this notion of territory. There are four types of territory, four species of territory. The first is the territory owned by a sovereign state, sovereign territory, territory within the boundaries of the state. This sovereign territory is the clearest example of what it means to be sovereign, within the territorial boundaries. Now there's another type of territory, a territory not owned by any particular state, but is under the protection of an organization, say the United Nations, or prior to that the League of Nations, or more recently under the protection of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in the case of Kosovo. This status, this not owned by a state but under the protection of another state, was meant to be a temporary state of affairs in which a state would be protected by a big brother state or by a big brother organization until such time as that state was able to gain its independence. A very good example of this was in the region now occupied by Israel, was formerly known as the Palestinian Mandate. It was an area that was under the protection of the UK, but arguably on a road to independence, on a road to self-determination. That Palestinian Mandate was what became the modern state of Israel. More recently, we had Kosovo, which, although now a state, recognized by many as a state, for a decade was under the protection of international organizations as well as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was essentially running the area, despite the fact that Kosovo lies entirely within the territorial boundaries of the country of Serbia. So the second category of territory not owned by a state, but has a special status. Now the third species of territory is territory that is capable of ownership, but is not under sovereign control. The Latin phrase for this type of territory is Terra Nullius. And Terra Nullius doesn't really exist anymore. This was a feature of a different world. For instance, back in the 1800s, most of Africa, the continent of Africa, was declared Terra Nullius, meaning there was no sovereign involved, and thus open to the world. So many of the European powers established colonies in Africa following this declaration of Terra Nullius, this idea that those territories were not under sovereign control, they were up for grabs. Not really the situation anymore. There's no more land in the world, there's no more territory that is not under the sovereign control of someone. And in fact, the era of Terra Nullius has been disregarded by the world, and clearly the concept that this land is up for grabs is no longer viable in the 21st century. The fourth type of territory is that territory which cannot be owned by any nation. The best example of that is Antarctica. The continent of Antarctica is not subject to the sovereign control of any nation, but instead is shared by all nations. One could argue that the North Pole is in a similar situation, although quite famously a few years back a Russian sub descended beneath the North Pole and planted a flag there, which many took as an indicator that Russia was asserting some sort of territorial control over the North Pole. But those are the four species of territory: sovereign territory, special status territory, Terra Nullius, that territory which is not under any sovereign control, and finally territory that cannot be owned by any nation, generally due to pre-existing treaties in which the nations of the world said that territory cannot be owned by a nation.